It's a huge pleasure to welcome a friend of the branch and a friend of many of us personally, Dr. Amy Coker, who was, she was the honorary secretary to the branch of the Classical Association many moons ago, when she took over from when I did that job and had to deal with my awful handwriting in the minutes and so on. And she took that role for a number of years. She did her PhD at Manchester with David Langslow and has since published widely on Greek and Latin linguistics and language, particularly around offence, around bodily fluids in a latest publication in a volume on that theme, and around issues of causing offence, language and swearing and politeness as well in Greek and Latin. And she does a lot of public talks to make a very, very difficult and technical subject extremely accessible. So she's the ideal person to talk to us this evening about this. She's associated with the University of Bristol and is currently teaching young people in a school in the Southwest. And Amy, it's a pleasure to have you, and I'll pass right over to you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me. So let me get this up and running. Okay. Okay, right, off we go. Thank you for coming, everyone who has made it. So just a few remarks before we start off. We're at the end of our full academic year under the conditions of a pandemic, and been pondering this in the last couple of weeks/hours. A very wise man once told me never to apologise at the start of a paper. But I do have to acknowledge, in the coming here to speak to you today, I have not spent the time in peaceful libraries or in overpriced cafes that I would like to have done in preparing this, and echo a lot of what April said in her opening remarks. A lot of what I'm going to say is quite raw in what follows, lots of things unsubstantiated, work in progress, so would welcome contributions, suggestions, your own observations of foul language in your own lives at the very end. Of course, I'll miss having a pint, a curry and a good natter with friends and people I've picked up on the way on my academic travels afterwards. But on the flip side, again, as April mentioned, in the past year, I've attended seminars from institutions all over the UK, which before the move online would simply have been impossible. And some of what follows has been directly informed by being able to listen to people's research from all over the place. So, there is a silver lining here, I think. Maybe. There's also something refreshingly egalitarian about online events, open to anyone with an internet connection. And again, that's a nice thing, I think, to sort of ponder on we come to the end of an academic year. Anyway, that's enough of my musing. Let's talk about swearing. Okay, right. The premise of what I want to say today is actually really quite simple. And in talking about a particular kind of language in ancient Greek, swearing, more about how I'm using that term in a couple of minutes, we've got to be really careful to step away from our innate prejudices about language and about what those kinds of people say, and what our expectations are about what we read in our ancient texts. We might find that plenty of ancient Greek people equally had an idea of what those kinds of people say is, and that bad people equals bad language, and vice versa. But we've got to try and find a line between the reality and the fiction of antiquity, and get towards some better approximation of what that reality was, or how far it's just a fantasy of the texts that have come down to us. As we go through this, we'll think about a few pervasive myths about both ancient peoples and some of our own linguistic outgroups and prejudices, think about some stereotypes, ancient and modern, and hear some ancient fruity language, and hopefully come closer to some of these subaltern voices of antiquity, even if those voices don't have rude words in them, and even if they do. So in a way, this is a kind of small attempt to get towards, to get away from a history of big men of the ancient world, which is still very pervasive, and which has been a theme of the wonderful programme that the CA for Manchester have put together this year. Oh, sorry, there we go. So, put simply, not everyone in the ancient world spoke like the Pericles of Thucydides. Not even Pericles himself, despite the white-painted pristine image of the height of civilization, which is still the stereotype of classical Greece. Okay. Now, what I'm going to talk here is not so much about specific words in Greek, although some will feature, but the broader code to which they belong, and what the interaction is between words and speech so labelled, so swearing, bad language, and the people who do or don't choose to use those words. And in fact, for the first time in a long time, I don't feel the strong need to issue a warning about what I'm about to talk about, but I should do that anyway. There will be the odd naughty word in English, a bit of casual chat about prostitution, the odd penis, and a few casual fucks. So consider yourselves duly warned. Free way to slip away if this is not for you. Okay, so first of all, what is swearing, inverted commas? So for my purposes, swearing can be equated to a broader category of bad or foul language, the kind of language which includes words imbued with a special kind of status. It's not an oath. Oh my God, that would be an oath. And in English, we have a whole plethora of ways that you can swear, that you can use words which are inappropriate. We've got the linguistically promiscuous fucking as an intensifier, which you get all over the place or all over the fucking place. Okay, so oh my fucking God is bad language, but oh my God isn't. Is the abbreviation OMFG okay? I honestly don't know, but either way, it's not as bad as saying those words in full. And then we think about abbreviation and how those work is quite interesting. So these are often the kinds of words which, generalising massively, something we'll come back to, are often deliberately restricted in how they are used by speakers or writers of a language. You can say pot plant, guppy, fish finger, or buttocks whenever you need to use those words to communicate something about the world around you to another person. And your choice is based upon how useful they are to you to convey factual information. Words like bollocks or shit, however, in English are used according to a more narrowly defined set of parameters. Parameters which are set by the individual as they negotiate their position with people they're speaking to or are around them in the world. It doesn't do to say shit in a department meeting unless your colleagues also happen to be very good friends or unless things get really heated. So we've got to think about when we're using these words and when we deploy them or choose not to. Okay, so a range of functions of bad language, and there's a whole host of them that we can think of. So expressions of anger, we might think about, expletives, insults, intensification. That's something that's quite unusual, I think, in English. Humour, it's funny. Seeing other people swear can be quite funny. Think how comedians work sometimes. Social glue, you can swear with your close colleagues and your close friends and get away with it. And the fact you can get away with it tells you something about the relationship you have with those people. The bottom one is, of course, a funny one that we don't really have in English, I don't think, but certainly in the classical Greek world, bad language was often used as part of fertility rituals or for ritual functions. I can't think of a contemporary British parallel, but I think penises and hen parties are not that sort of linguistic habit, but there's definitely sort of a habit there that's to do with some kind of ritual, which we could think a bit about. For the ancient Greeks, and again, this is an enormous, nebulous, perhaps not very useful term. To put it into perspective, even on GCSE Greek, the literature options cover a 1,000-year span from Homer to Lucian. This is the kind of span of language that we're talking about under this catch-all term. Of course, this is one of the reasons that I love Greek, but the labels don't make it any easier for us sometimes. Anyway, for the ancient Greeks, such language is sometimes associated with the sick and the mad, as we get from some observations in the Hippocratic corpus. So Hippocrates, mythical, historical figure associated with medicine. In some of those text mentions of bad language associated when people are very sick or have mental problems. Perhaps akin to the loss of other kinds of self-control, which might be associated with being really ill. Using bad language is associated with the transgression of societal norms. And people like the Cynic philosophers, who performed bodily functions usually associated with privacy in open view, that kind of idea of breaking boundaries. Indeed, this is what bad language is. It's a composite of the kinds of words you really should not say, a verbal gesture that you should not make. By its very nature, it crosses the boundary of what those who've worked on offensive language have called the middle-class politeness criterion. wordy phrase for something that I think we all kind of know what it is. So in the same way that I can put that on the screen, and everyone in the audience could imagine a list of words which could fill that slot. You all know your swear words, even though you might not choose to use them very often. We know these words in the same way that we know we shouldn't spit in public, we should be kind to strangers, and we shouldn't come to a public lecture in just our pants. To do those things would be not nice. It would be impolite, improper, break the rules of etiquette. Nevertheless, in the right or wrong circumstances, these words are produced, or they simply wouldn't exist. Okay, so we know they're there. And there's a nice paradox here. Omission draws attention to something and reinforces it. So the effect of "don't say shit" preserves the word. That's the same effect as missing out a bit of translation in some naughty Latin or Greek poetry. It highlights where the naughty bits are. You've got a kind of students reach for their dictionaries to find out what's going on. Okay, so likewise, we know this language is there in the ancient world, but people don't really write it down very often. And often, which is really, really frustrating, we are specifically told someone will not write it down. And you've got a nice anecdote here from about a guy called Archytas. He's a pre-Socratic philosopher of the 4th century BC, so he's kind of a classical Greek. And you have this little anecdote where he was in general well-behaved. It's not the sexiest translation. And he avoided bad language, so akosmoton and amoton. And once when he was compelled to use something unbecoming, okay, apropos, he didn't use the word, but wrote it on the wall. Okay, and he's writing that down, sure, not saying it out loud, but there's this same principle of, I don't want to say it, I don't want to put it out there, but I know what the word is. Okay, so to some extent we're chasing ghosts here, and this might be the end of the paper and indeed of an academic career, but there are some glimpses of bad language lurking at the messy edges of the canon of Greek literature if we look in the right places and if we turn over the right rocks. And our canonical texts, so the kind of the real core of what we think of as Greek literature, need to be interrogated quite hard to see what they can actually tell us. We're unlikely to find this kind of language in tragedy, for example, because of the literary pretensions of those kinds of texts and the rules of the genre of tragedy. Our tragic heroes don't swear. Okay. Old comedy, and here we think of Aristophanes, of course, is the opposite, where we expect fart and willy jokes, and we expect Aristophanic Greeks to be more unrestrained. It's funny, and that's the point of old comedy, and the festival context suggests that's appropriate as well. Now, today, rather than look at the relationship between text and context, and how far text type can be used as a guide for the nature of the vocabulary contained within it, that's a whole other topic. For the rest of today, I want to talk about particular types of people who are said to display such verbal behaviours, and who we might expect to have been foul-mouthed and written those things down if they felt the need to. Indeed, if they could. Levels of literacy is a whole extra facet of the question. So what I want to do is think a little about some stereotypes and how real or not they might have been. So we've got idioms in English to start us off, such as swear like a fishwife, whichever one of those is. Again, I don't know how far these are my Midlands dialect. Others people may have different ones. Again, love to hear those in questions. Or we swear like a trooper. Other modern languages have their own idioms. To go by a great thread on Twitter a while back, in Russian, you swear like a cobbler, and in French, like a carriage driver. And again, those who speak other languages, please share examples or corrections to those examples I've given, or disagree with them or whatnot. Likewise, in the same thread, there was an idle comment that in Thai, one has a dog mouth. Rather than being foul-mouthed, again, reminiscent of this dirty dog stereotype, which gave the cynic philosophers their name. It's a nice sort of cross-cultural connection there, which is quite nice. So here, what we could think of is there is a kind of linguistic voyeurism. They say these words, we do not. But we do understand what these words are, and we know what those people mean. So I enjoy seeing other people being naughty in their language habits, but of course I'm not like that. There's a kind of a double nature here. So some words to do with sex might be labelled as explicit or graphic, but you've got a kind of double pornography here when these words are put into the mouths of particular kind of fantastical characters, some of them fictional inhabitants of the ancient city, and some of this is fantasy is modern and some is ancient, and that's sort of what I want to pick away a little bit at in the rest of the talk. So here are a few groups and stereotypes, and again please note that this is absolutely work in progress in what follows. Right, so prostitutes and women. So we might think of women as a particular outgroup in society are prostitutes. Nice girls don't sell sex. Okay, and we might think about how far such women are associated with foul words and how correct such an assumption might be. The cartoon which you've got on the screen is from the 18th century, and incidentally, if you read this in a Liverpudlian accent, it's absolutely amazing, thanks to a former colleague from Liverpool who read this out once to me in her amazing Scouse. I have enormous affection for Liverpool, but yes, great sort of two women having a good go at each other. Okay. It's later in the classical period, but indeed we do have such working girl banter preserved in a text which is kind of, preserved in part by the diners in Athenaeus's Deipnos Sophistae of the 2nd century AD. This is a massive compilation of already ancient texts and sayings and bits and bobs and jokes, all kinds of things which are otherwise not preserved. And the work that the Deipnos Sophistae preserves is full of witty jokes, albeit with a sexual tone that kind of which is supposedly what these women, these hetairae, these sex workers said. And here they're constructed as appropriate vehicles for talking about sex, or I think rather for men to talk about sex, who the guys are women. We also have Lucian's Dialogues of the Courtesans from roughly the same period, again, when we're 700 years post-classical. And of course, this is not intended to be an honest reflection of what real prostitutes, what real sex workers say to each other. It's a construction written by a man, by someone else, not a prostitute. We also get occasional references to the language of prostitutes in the scholarship. So Jim Adams mentioned this a little bit in the Latin section vocabulary when he talks about Greek brothel slang, and that Greek-speaking prostitutes may have introduced some sex words from Greek into Latin. I think that's possible, but again, this is not the only way that Greek words for sex are coming into Latin. It's not just that those who were paid to have sex talk about sex, even women talk about sex, and this is something that we'll come back to. We do have some actual Greek graffiti, some real graffiti, ancient texts, handwritten ancient texts from Pompeii. Of course, this is 1st century AD, very different context to classical Greece, but we do have some Greek graffiti from Pompeii in the structure known as the Lupana, the purpose-built brothel. But of course, how much agency we give women in this space is impossible to think about, and how far this reflects their vernacular Greek or not is impossible to judge. And I could rant at length about how this space is treated by tour guides and visitors to Pompeii, but not now. Okay. Now, and while I don't want to get into visual culture so much, I do want to share this with you. Okay, so this is a vase image reprinted in Alex Mitchell's book on visual humour, labelled as a drunk old prostitute with sagging breasts and a triple chin. Now, this image speaks for a stereotype, I think, of the anti-proper woman. Okay, and I'd like to suggest this stands for something that we can't see, which is the way this woman would have been perceived to speak. Now, we don't associate this figure with the perfect woman, and that's certainly not what Alex Mitchell posits when he describes this image in this way. Okay, so she has physical defects, she's old, she's got a triple chin. And again, I think we might ask whose stereotype is this? In fact, that's another question we could get into. Okay, but we certainly wouldn't associate this figure with powerful and persuasive speech of a figure like, for example, Euripides' Medea. Or indeed of Homer's Andromache. But of course, in turn, remember that both those two women are fictional. Where are our real strong women of ancient Greek literature or history, and where is their voice? Where's our female Pericles? Do we even have one? There aren't many out there. So yeah, where do we go with this? Okay. What I want to do now is talk about some potentially slightly more real, but also still not real women and their bad language in Aristophanes. So this is about the play Aristophanes, 5th century BC, playwright, old comedy. This is a little bit, so Praxagora appears in his Ecclesia Zeusi, his assembly women, and Praxagora is kind of the heroine, I suppose, and note how the play is talked about here. The harsh satire, it is a play which has teemed with gross and unpleasant language. The play is often characterised as ugly because of the amount of sexual chatter in it, although I do perhaps wonder part of this is because it's lots of women who are uttering some of these words. Praxagora herself definitely has some very choice bad words and an astonishingly detailed few lines about male masturbation, which I won't put on the slide for you. That's line 703 to 9 if you're interested. Okay, binumenito, that's one of our, as close as we can get to pinning these down, that's one of our taboo terms for sex in Greek, bineo. Okay. But what if this is actually real? This is a woman in a play on stage, written by a man, played by a man on stage, of course. What's actually real here? These authentic voices are very rare. We have some strongly painted female characters in drama, but how far are any of these and their speech real, or are they a male fantasy of the way women speak or act if left to their own devices? Likewise, anonymous old woman A talks about wanting to get pounded. Note here in particular the passive way in which these two women in Aristophanes speak about having sex. They don't have sex, they are you can't even do that in the passive in English. Being fucked, getting pounded. Okay, this is passive. Again, is this the way women spoke about sex, or the way men talk about women talking about sex? Okay, that's subtle, but I think important. Likewise, are the sexual metaphors in Praxagora's vulgar and crude prologue, as Henderson puts it, male or female? If we assume men and women are using different metaphors to talk about sex. I'm not sure how far they do or don't, but I think we have to be sensitive that in particular in a society where men and women are a bit more segregated, and I think that's a reasonable assumption, the languages used may have been different, or the metaphors may have been different. So how far are these women unventriloquized? So in Aristophanes' comic play, The Lysistrata, so to move to another play, one of the women, no, it's an old woman again, who speaks in this fashion. Do old women get linguistically out of control as they get older in Aristophanes? Says she will beat the shit out of a city official. How plausible is this? Is this imaginable to be spoken? And this is a bit of text that I keep coming back to over and over again. The magistrate is shocked by what he, not just by the threat of physical violence here, I think also, but the fact that she's used this word epikese, shit. And he repeats it in his response. Oh my God, you said epikese. Note also the translation here, dirty mouth. That's actually not what the Greek says. The Greek says literally that she chatters like this. Okay, so that's again an imposition on the text, a modern imposition, using an English metaphor that is not so well attested for classical Greek. Okay. This brings us to a much bigger conversation about women's language versus that of men. Do women really swear less than men? In a recent book on gender and politeness, Sarah Mills reports that even in a survey from the year 2000 of university students, there were still pervasive beliefs that men and children swear in particular ways, and swearing by women was tolerated less than swearing by men. Women are stereotypically polite, and we think about earlier comments from Lakoff, like talking like a lady. Nice women don't swear. And I'm sure most women in my audience have experienced situations in which men are seen as assertive, women are seen as aggressive. And maybe like the first old woman in Lysistrata, I've certainly got angry about this kind of thing as I've gotten older. Maybe older women genuinely are more frank in their behaviours, verbal or otherwise. Having had a big birthday recently, I'm feeling this even more. So what are universal linguistic behaviours? massive question. It's perhaps certain to think, for our purposes, that to a greater extent, it's men who are dictating our view of women in ancient Greek-speaking world, or our view of, men dictate our view of women in the ancient world speaking, in the ancient Greek-speaking world, and these men think women should speak in a certain way, therefore they do speak in a certain way. So there's a universal here, even if it's not particularly useful. We have to be aware of how these texts are created, these voices are created by men for us. Obvious, I think, but worth remembering. So are there any sites of authentic female voices? Spindle whorls, perhaps, or tools of specifically female trades, like woolwork, may offer something. Again, it's hard to say with any certainty that it's a woman who's written an inscription on an object, even if it's used by a woman. There's a Sicilian loom weight, for example, that appears to have a word gerra, which is probably a slang word for female genitalia, and a woman's name, but who's writing that is difficult or impossible to know. Okay, so done women. Briefly, youths, soldiers, and then a surprise guest at the end. So what about youths, or more specifically, young men and boys who stereotypically break norms, either as part of aggression or negotiation of status? Again, do adolescents really swear more than adults? We've got a nice precedent here. And in fact, in Lucian's Dialogues of the Courtesans, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, this is alluded to. And in this text, we're told that there's been some graffiti written up, and this graffiti causes a rift between two lovers. There's something salacious here. It's simply Melita loves Hermotimus, and then a bit lower down, it's said to have been written Hermotimus loves Melita. But importantly for our purposes, the text tells us that this is said to be the work of youths. Okay, so you've got graffiti here specifically associated with naughty, idle hands, idle boys, okay, youthful exuberance. Having said that, and having said that the graffiti we've got talked about here doesn't have any rude words in it, lots of real graffiti, extant graffiti, does have lots of bad words in it. Famously, we have a number of inscriptions with the word oifo is written in Thera. Oifo being the word for fuck, effectively, in some dialects of classical Greek. It's binno in classical Athens and Attic dialects, but oifo in Doric ones. And people have, again, made various things of this. Idle hands doodling as part of a sexual initiation ritual. People have various fantasies about this. And again, interestingly, I think no one's ever suggested that these are women writing these comments and these words. So again, thinking about our own prejudices put onto our ancient texts. Sticking with youths, I can't give a talk without mentioning what I think might be my favourite item from the ancient world ever, which is the so-called indecent proposal letter. So this is a letter, a sort of mock letter preserved from Oxyrhynchus, a town in Egypt, very famous for the huge amounts of papyri that have been discovered there, everyday papyri. So there is some literature, but there's lots of everyday stuff, census returns, Dr. Pudsey, letters, taxation documents, everything, the everyday rubbish of the ancient world. Now, it's been suggested that this is a schoolroom exercise. It's a letter to the left, parodied by the presumably boys who are producing it. And there are plenty of tabooed words in this. There we go, it's pagidzo a couple of times, and we've got two very rude words there, and there's your drawing in the margin. So at the top we've got psole, and underneath kai, ficus, two very rare words, ficus in particular. I'll talk about this maybe later, what's going on here. Now, this is basically the ancient equivalent of drawing a penis in the margin of a school book or a textbook, which is kind of what you've got here, but slightly more anatomically detailed. Now, and I can assure you that it's not just boys who have the habit of drawing a penis in the margin of a textbook, although it's probably more likely that boys are doing this more regularly than girls, perhaps. Okay, so again, we've got, if this is a school exercise, this is boys' hands who are doing this. So idle hands are swearing when they can get away with it, they think. Okay, sticking with some other stereotypes briefly, swearing like a trooper. Okay. So for troopers, so thinking about types of men who might be swearing, we need look no further perhaps than Homer. Homeric warriors in the Iliad throw some choice insults at one another as part of their warrior posturing on the battlefield. Now they're having a fight, they can shout abuse at each other. And in book 11 of the Iliad, we have some real gems. Diomedes calls one of his enemies a dog. Dogs earlier, cynics earlier, so dogs featuring quite heavily. And later we have a coward. Okay, that's sort of an insult sensible for a battlefield. And we also get this amazing string of words directed at Paris. It's again a slightly peculiar translation, but these insults are really hard to translate, something we can perhaps talk about later. So archeress Landra, beautiful of hair, oglet of girls. Or in the Penguin translation, bowman and braggart, with your pretty love locks and your glad eye for the girls. And interestingly, this line actually gets excerpted and quoted much later in a 2nd century text by Suetonius, the biographer of the Caesars, who also writes lots of Greek texts. And he writes a Greek work on insults, and this makes it into his book of insults, which has a wonderfully interesting history. Either way, kind of striking. Now, the undertone here is clearly of Paris of being a bit girly, his hair's too pretty, but also too into women. He's the parthenopipa. This is the cause of the Trojan War, so this is an appropriate insult, if you like. The reference to his hair is interesting. Why would you insult his hair? But you do get references to hair on and off in other places in insults in Greek literature. Much later as well, we know the Roman Emperor Domitian is quite touchy about his boldness. That's perhaps not so surprising, that men maybe worry about boldness. But the hair references we occasionally get, perhaps there's something about hair and status that's quite maybe different to what we have. Now, we might compare these insulting, but presumably not desperately offensive or sweary words. These words don't appear to be, in the technical term, typically dysphomistic. They don't tend to be words that would not be used in polite company. We could compare those with what we have in a very different kind of warrior, who is the Scythian archer in Aristophanes' Thesmophoria Zeusi. But note here, the stereotype runs in both directions. Noble Homeric warriors are not supposed to swear, according to us. But was this the case according to Homer? I personally think there's a lot more humour in Homer than the traditional view of Homer would tend to have us believe. And of course, when you've got words like lorbeiter, which are incredibly rare, what do you do with a very limited distribution? How far do we think these words are kind of imbued with an offensive content and not? Again, something I think just to be aware of, that our textual stereotypes are doing a lot. We're working them quite hard when we're thinking about the individual words that they contain. Okay. Anyway, the Scythian archer, comic depiction of him from a pot on the left, more formal depiction of the Scythian archer, almost like classical Athens' police force on the right. He definitely does indeed swear like a trooper, with plenty of otherwise tabooed sex and genitalia words, including a splendid sex verb not attested anywhere else, from the word proktos, arsehole. He also uses the word miaros a couple of times, and that's the word that we're going to come back to in the very end in a couple of minutes. The Scythian archer in Aristophanes is doubly marked as an outsider by his less than fluent command also of Attic Greek, which we might read in tandem with his very, very non-fancy language, his offensive words. This is perhaps a stereotype for Aristophanes and his audience of what foreign soldiers sound like. They have a limited command of Greek, but they know loads of swear words. And that's certainly what kind of he reads like when you read him. When it comes to more real soldiers, we do have a few sling bullets with offensive terms on them. Not a huge number, better attested in Latin than for Greek. And again, this is very much akin to Second World War painting messages and pictures on artillery shells and bombs. That's what they're doing, but occasionally they're writing kind of offensive words on them and throwing them at the enemy. Okay, so coming towards the end, finally, a little bit on the clowns of my title. So sadly, there is not enough here on clowns. The bolmolokoi, parasitoi, gelotopoioi here. These are figures in the classical period that I wanted to do a lot more on, but just didn't quite get the chance to do it. These are men, and I think just men, who are not boys, I suspect, who are scraping together a living through quips or some kind of humour, making people laugh. Much later in the Roman periods, there are figures of fun who you occasionally hear of, normally when they get it wrong and upset an emperor. There's also an amazing bit of Seneca where he talks about raising sweary slave children as clowns, which again deserves a lot of thinking about. But again, these are people who are entertaining, making a living through using verbal quips and clever obscenities, who are walking the line of acceptability of verbal behaviours, as many modern comics do. I think we have got evidence that this is also happening in the ancient world. So instead of looking at these characters, these clowns who deserve much more attention, I'd like to finish briefly about talking about someone who I consider clown in chief for the classical city, and that's the god Hermes, because if there is an ancient Greek god of swearing, it is Hermes. Just humour me for the last little bit. So Hermes is essentially a god of transitions. He's clever with words, he is tricksy, he is a trickster figure, as we see in lots of Indo-European myths. He's the god who is the closest to mortals in lots of respects. He tells dirty jokes occasionally. And of course, there are statues of him throughout many Greek cities, the Hermes, with an erection. Of all the gods who appear in extant old comedy and satyr drama, Hermes is the most common. You can poke fun at Hermes in Aristophanes. And we find him being mocked for having a huge number of different epithets. So it's always kind of local ritual names. And in fact, Hermes as the god of deception is invoked by Euripides in the Thesmophorid Zeusi in the bit with the Scythian archer. So he's not afraid to be involved in the rough language. When it comes to the words which Aristophanes puts into his mouth, I imagine him being a bit like Malcolm Tucker from the Naughties series In the Thick of It, written by Armando Iannucci, starring, of course, Peter Capaldi, which some have described as the 21st century's answer to Yes Minister. Malcolm Tucker is the aggressive, profane and feared director of communications for the government. So what you've got now on my penultimate slide is a few bits of, is it Hermes or is it Malcolm Tucker? All these hands all over the place. You were like a sweaty octopus trying to unhook a bra. Your total filthiest. How did you get here? Come the fuck in or fuck the fuck off. Feet off the furniture, you Oxbridge twat. You're not on a pump now. As someone who went to Cambridge, I feel I can get away with that. Okay, right. So some of it is Malcolm Tucker. Some of it is Hermes. There we go. This is the one that is Hermes from Peace, Aristophanes' Peace, to the left of your slide. Okay, you shameless, outrageous scum, you scum, total scum, you absolute scumbag. How have you come here, scummiest of all scumbags? Not the most elegant translation, but this is essentially the word miaros. It means vile or filthy or dirty. I've tried to do something with this there with the different forms of it. Suggestions for this, much appreciated. Miaros, this word probably doesn't have the tone of English fuck, although Eleanor Dickey in her book on terms of address counts it as one of the more offensive terms in her book on insults, or chapter on insults. But certainly the cumulative use of this word is quite similar. Come the fuck in or fuck the fuck off, even though the way the syntax is working there is very, very different. So Aristophanes might not be putting overtly offensive words in Hermes' mouth, and I haven't checked all of Hermes' appearances in extant drama to see if he ever does. That would be quite nice to find out. Maybe that's a step too far even for Aristophanes. But Hermes definitely doesn't object to the foul language of the world he's engaged with in Aristophanes. So the existence of a god who is portrayed like this reminds us, if we needed to be reminded, that the Greek gods are very different to that of Christians, and that as divine stereotypes go, the Christian model is not the one we need for the ancient Greek world. So what stereotypes do we need? A quick few words by way of conclusion, and then I will finish up. So who swore and why does it matter? So the ancient Greeks had a usual suspects of sweary people, just as we do, but swearing in reality, I think we have to accept is much more widespread and normal, and again, I suspect up to the individual within the place in society they're speaking. Intersectional, I think about maybe. We need not be taken in by the seductive presentation of reality some texts give us, especially when we read something like Aristophanes. and be wary of the modern stereotypes that we put upon the texts, especially if those stereotypes are actually very similar. If the ancient ones look very much like the modern ones, we're taken in by them. Nice women don't swear, boys do. The same stereotype doesn't make the actual representation of those groups any more authentic. It just reinforces the stereotype, which of course is there, but so Aristophanes' portrayal of the world of Athens might be quite realistic, but it's still not real. We're not quite there yet. So in thinking about these universals, the lesson is to ponder power asymmetries reflected in language, not just in the ancient past, but also in our own times, since there is this constant dialogue between the ancient texts, the ancient languages we look at, and the languages we speak in our own modern everyday world. That is it. I will finish up and leave Malcolm Tucker there. Thank you for having me.